Now that we know some of the basics of C++ programming, let's try to put it into action with an example. Here I've come up with an example that we'll just try to program through really quickly. It'll be available on Canvas after I'm done uploading this, and you can work through it as well on your own. I encourage you to try and do this before watching me do it, and you can come back and pause the video and watch me walk through it afterwards. Now we have a program here where we want to find the circumference and the area of a circle given some radius. And we're going to use a variable for the radius rather than try to get it from the user, which we can do later. Just recall that the area of a circle is pi r squared, where r is the radius, and the circumference of a circle is 2 pi r. First things first, let's include IOStream, which is the library that cout is included in. That way now we can print. And then we'll also use namespace standard, just so we don't have to type as much. I did make a typo. Let's move that there. Next, let's give a main here. So remember, main is always the starting point of the program. So we do that with int main, parentheses, and then curly braces for the actual program where that goes. And now it'll start here. Now, one thing to maybe note about what we're trying to program here is that pi is in both the area formula and the circumference formula, and pi in math is a consistent number. It's a constant, right? So what we'll do for that is we will create a constant, and we will set it equal to what pi is equal to. That way, we have a variable that just doesn't change over the course of the program, and that's exactly what pi should do, right? Is it should always be the same number, 3.14. Now, I've been writing all of my code in main previously, but what I'll do here is I'm going to actually put this outside. You have the option with variables to either put them at the global scope, is what it's called, outside of main, or do it inside of main as well. You can't write any code outside of functions like main, but we can write variable declarations and set them. So I can write variable declarations and definitions outside of functions, and that's called a global variable. So this is a global constant for pi. And what global means is just I can use it anywhere. Here all we have is main, so I'm just going to be able to use it there, but if we had more things on top of main, then we'd be able to use them in those scopes as well. You want to avoid using global variables as much as possible. Things like constants are pretty good to put out there, but actual variables, especially with names that you're going to use commonly, is considered bad practice because you tend to be able to make more mistakes if you do it. But for the sake of our program, putting pi here I think is okay. Another thing maybe to note is that pi is in capital letters. It's common to give constants as capital letters, all capital letters, when you name them in programming languages. So I'm going to do that here. And then also notice that we've marked it as a constant and that it's a float, which just means that it's a decimal number. So if this was an integer, it wouldn't work. It would just be 3. Another thing I realized that I forgot to mention, and it's not necessary in order for your program to compile, but because main here returns an integer, which we'll discuss what returning means. It essentially just means after it's done running. We want to return an integer of 0. And we know now integers are just counting numbers. Here, what this represents is an exit code, so it tells how the program exited, whether it was successful in running or if it encountered some kind of error. The number 0 specifically is the error code for success, or the exit code, sorry, not error code, exit code for success. When we return 0, it tells whoever ran the program that it ran successfully. If we don't put this return 0 here, it will just automatically do it. The compiler will fill it in for you, but I figure it might be good to just put it there. Now let's actually try to solve the problem. We want a radius, and the radius we'll say we'll also make that a float. Apologies. we need to put float and then radius, so we'll call it radius, and then we will assign it some sort of number. Here, let's just start with 3, and we can change it and see that it will update the area and the circumference as we write more of the program. Now let's try to actually solve this. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to create 2 variables, one for the area and one for the circumference. We'll use these to store the actual area and circumference, and we'll calculate them here in a second. So we know here from the formula that area is equal to pi r squared and circumference is equal to 2 pi r, so let's calculate those really quick. Area is equal to pi, which we know is pi with capitals, is what we named it, times r, which we called radius. And we know that it's pi r squared, so that just means that it's pi times the radius times the radius. Now C++ doesn't have an exponent operator built in, so you can't just write something like times times to make it work. Some languages do have that, but we would have to import a library in order to do powers in C++. For the time being, we'll just do radius times radius to do r squared. That takes care of the radius. Let's do the circumference. And the circumference will be equal to pi times 2 times r. So let's write that in that order. 2 pi r. And just to clear it up, I know I'm spacing in between these operators, like the times and the plus, and I've been doing that in the previous programs. You don't have to do that. That's just a me thing. If anything, I think it's just easier to read. One thing to note is that it will ignore spaces, so the compiler will get rid of any spaces when it actually goes to compile it. So me putting spaces here doesn't really matter. I just think it's easier to read. So this will calculate the area, and this one calculates circumference. Now that we've calculated them, let's go ahead and print them to the screen. Recall that we can do that with cout. And then I want maybe the word radius in front of radius, so I'll do that with a string. Remember, that's double quotes. And I'll say radius equals radius. And then we'll start a new line with end line. And then we'll do the same thing for the circumference. All right, and there's our program. Let's make sure that it works really quick. Okay, and it's opened here on my end, and you'll see that when we run it, we get a radius of 3 and a circumference of 18.84. So I must have made a mistake, which is, oh, whoops, I was showing the radius. I guess that's fine. We'll look at that too. Let's do the radius and the area. So we calculated the area. I meant to print that instead of the radius. Here we go. Let's rerun that. That was my bad. And we'll see that the radius is 3, which is what we typed in. The area is 28, which is about 3 squared times pi, which is approximately a little bit bigger than 27, so that checks out. And circumference would be 2 times pi times r, which would be about 6 times pi, so about a little bigger than 18. So this seems to check out as well. Now, if we wanted to have it be a different radius, then we could totally just replace this here. Now, there's a concept in programming where you could just place in the radius where it was. Now, I used a variable called radius, but if I knew the radius was going to be 3, I could type it in here and type it in here as well, right? This would calculate the same thing. But if I want to update the radius, and I know I used it in 4 places here, 2 times in the calculation for area, once in the circumference, and once in printing, if I'm going to use something a lot, it's a good idea to use a variable and not just hard code it and write the number straight in. If you use a number and just place it in your code directly instead of using a variable, that's called a magic number, and it's just because if you're reading the code as an outside observer, you might see it and just be kind of confused as to where it comes from. if we look at my code here, it's very obvious that it's the radius now, right? But if I had just put 3 in there, then it's not as obvious what that 3 actually means and why I put it in there, especially if you're writing a large program. So always try to use variables or constants if you're going to be reusing a number a lot, or even just using it once, because it does make it easier to understand as well as adjust later. So no magic numbers if you can. It's generally not a good practice to do that. Anyways, let's end off by just double checking that this works with other radii. So maybe we could do this with a radius of 10.7 and just make sure that it works. And we should see that it updates pretty quickly. So all of these will get filled in with 10.7. And when we run it, we do see the radius is 10.7 and the area and circumference are much bigger than they were before. You could double check this on a calculator. I'm going to guess that we programmed this right. And there you have it. So this was just a quick example on how to use the basic programming concepts that we've covered so far, that being printing, variables, and constants.